Our second lesson this morning comes from a reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and I will be reading verses 10 and 11, and then moving to verse 16, and then reading until the end of the chapter. I invite you to follow along in your pew Bible, or simply listen for the Word of God as I read these words from Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building on it. Each builder must choose with care how to build on it. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one that has been laid. That foundation is Jesus Christ. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. Do not deceive yourselves. If you think you are wise in this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, for it is written, He catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. So let no one boast about human leaders, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all belong to you, and you belong to Christ. And Christ belongs to God. This is the word of the Lord. The common theme of both of these texts, Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, this passage that I read, and the Leviticus text, is holiness. Holiness. The Leviticus text, God speaking through Moses says, you are to be holy as I am holy. And then Paul speaking to the church in Corinth says, my temple is holy and you are that temple. Now, what is holiness to you? Word associations. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Holiness. Godliness? The Pope? Okay. Anybody else? Security? Purity. Purity? I'm not hearing some of these. Okay. I think of all kinds of things. I think of holy things and holy people. I think of, it just looks like a plate and a cup, but in liturgical terms, this is a chalice and a paten, set apart, holy, holy vessels. Baptismal font is holy. It's set apart for a certain purpose, and it looks like we ought to wash it more often. Sanctuary is holy, set apart. Linda mentioned the Pope, holy people. Ministers are thought to be holy because of the vestments that we wear. Holiness has in mind something that is set apart from the world in a certain sense, but if it's completely opposed to the ordinary in our Reformed understanding, that is not right. My teacher, a great Reformed theologian, Doug Otati, once said that the ordinary is holy and the holy is ordinary. The way he put it was, he talked about the sanctification of the ordinary and the mundane disciplining of the spirit. In other words, the holy is ordinary stuff that can be set apart, to be sure. That's just a common plate and a common cup. It's set apart. And so are we, all of us. In a sense, we're holy. The holy, in any real sense, is intensely communal. It's a good question. Can you be wholly separate from a community? Paul doesn't think so. In our Reformed understanding of that, I mean, it's the church. We're set apart. It's a community of faith. And the Bible always speaks of that. It's a misunderstanding of Paul when Paul talks about the Spirit's residing in you. Some people think they mean the Spirit resides in my person and my body is a temple. But it's important to know that you in the Greek is plural. It's you all or y'all, right? It's y'all. It's all of us. You are holy. It's intensely communal. And that's what makes it in some ways promising and in other ways difficult. Paul, in another letter, in the second letter to the church at Corinth, talked about the church as a treasure in earthen vessels. It's always got to be earthy. It's always got to be in the stuff of life. It's got to be earthy. Some of us think it might be sometimes a little too earthy. But in some sense, it can never be earthy enough because it's God's good creation set apart for use by God, for mission by God, for ministry by God. That's the power of it. And then in this Leviticus text, there is no more earthy an understanding of holiness. It's a fascinating text, and I'm surprised I've never preached on it, even though it's a central text in Judaism. It's a restatement, kind of reconfiguring of the Ten Commandments. Obviously, we know the Ten Commandments in Exodus a lot better than this text, but it's a really interesting restatement, and it's very important in Judaism. This text is read in the high holy days on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. So important is this text. And notice how the text orders holy life. It's a fascinating treatment of holy life. Holiness is about holiness at home. It's about holiness in our common worship together, and it's about social ethics. All of those are connected. All of them are in a stream connected. You might call it a ladder only if each ingredient to the ladder is connected to the other. One foundation is set on the other. That's Paul's image of it all. It all sets on a foundation. Nothing is not essential. Nothing is an afterthought. It's all connected, one to the other. All is integral to the other. So let's go over them. It's interesting that Leviticus mentions honoring your father and your mother. And the way I would read that is in our common Reformed understanding of things. The Puritans and the Anglicans way back, and the Puritans did have a few things to say, by the way. They get really bad rap these days, but the Puritans had a few wonderful things to say, and one of them was talking about the home life as a little commonwealth. A little commonwealth that corresponds to what you hope for and work for in the world in the larger commonwealth. So I always do this in my wedding homilies when I talk about a couple getting married, but it's good for any of you in your home life. How you break bread in your home life should correspond to how you hope the world breaks bread and what you're willing to work for in the world as far as food policy. The same goes with economics. The same goes with almost everything else that you can imagine. The two things correspond one to the other, and they connect. They're integral one to the other. Now let's go on to the next aspect of holiness that Leviticus lifts up, which is Sabbath keeping. Sabbath keeping is, interestingly enough, connected to idolatry. I mean, they go one right next to the other, and I think there's a reason for that. Because you see, left to our own devices, we are much more likely to image God after ourselves. Now think about that for a second. We're much more likely to image God after ourselves and who we are and what we do, our class, our economics, our way of being, and therefore let God underwrite and bless who we already are when the opposite should be the case. Because you see, the former is the very definition of idolatry. It's making God into ourselves and our class, and our race, and our gender, etc., etc., etc. When worship is to do the opposite. Sabbath keeping is, in some sense, deconstructing the way we image God so that we can then be imaged after God, which is holiness. It's a process of deconstruction and reconstruction. We always say that about sanctuary. You know, we have beautiful stained glass in this sanctuary, but classic Reformed understanding of a sanctuary has windows that you can see through. They're transparent so you can see the world. We come here to be reminded where God is in the world because we always get that messed up. In other words, we have a transformative experience inside worship. We're transformed, we're deconstructed and reconstructed. That's why we start worship with confession, right? And then we reimagine, we're resurrected. It's like dying and rising. We're resurrected in this process and to live in the image of God. Now that's connected with all the prohibitions in these commandments. It's a very interesting thing. There are varieties of deconstructions that go on. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't hold a grudge, da-da-da-da-da. You got them, you know? They're negatives for a purpose. It's deconstructing in order to reconstruct. Now, one of the most interesting to me deconstructions comes with economics, common economics in the world. It's fascinating that this text first explores, before it gets to the traditional 10 Commandments, it first talks about economics in the world. Remember what it says. Do not harvest everything. Leave the gleanings and leave the outer sides for the poor and the alien. And don't gather up all the grapes. Leave some of them for the poor and the alien. Do you get it? They're talking about the economic policy in the world. And the interesting thing about it is it's exactly the opposite way that we do it. You see, we're prone to think about the poor and the outcast after we get everything that we need, right? After we've already harvested everything and gone to the market and sold it. Or after we've gathered all of the grapes and made the wine and taken it to the store. Then we think, oh, I've got a little left over. I think I'll give it to the poor and the outcast. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. What the policy is, according to Torah, is the first thing you think about is the poor and the outcast. That's the first thing you do. So you don't let Wall Street do their thing and then give them just a little bit on the side after everything is already gathered, after you've already made your investments, after all this. No, the first policy, if we were going to do it in a modern age, is a living wage bill, I think. The first policy is actually ensuring that everybody has a good work to do. There's a common life together. You see, the agricultural language back in the ancient world, it's altogether clear. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And Leviticus will say that. So it's not like you're letting people on private land. You're letting people on God's land. And they have a good work to do. So you make sure the common good is in place for the poor and the outcast first and foremost. And that's what holiness is about. It's about deconstructing the things and the ways we get it wrong and the idolatries of the world so that we can be about reimagining the world in God's image, the way God would have it. It's about getting first things first. That's what holiness is about. It's about, in other words, loving neighbor as yourself. Now, explicating all that is you may be thinking to yourself, as I am, that's not easy. This holiness stuff, that's not easy, is it? See, I just thought holiness was getting apart and just praying a little bit. Well, no, it's a lot more than that. It's a lot of work. So how do you get at this stuff? I mean, what's the first step? In thinking about that, I was reminded of a story that my guitar teacher told me about the great guitarist John Williams. Maybe some of you have heard him. Arguably the greatest guitarist in the world today, certainly the greatest classical guitarist. His technique is said to be impeccable. It's interesting that it is said of John Williams that you could put a piece of music in front of him that he had never seen before, and on first sight he'll play it perfectly. A very gifted individual. In fact, the great classical guitarist Andreas Segovia once saw John Williams play when John Williams was only 16 years old, and Segovia said, God has placed a great gift on that young man. My guitar teacher told me an interesting story about John Williams. John Williams was being interviewed about his life and about his music. And the interviewer asked him the question, what is the most important lesson that you learned about the guitar? And Williams immediately responded, flesh and nail. Flesh and nail, he said. Well, the interviewer shook her head and said, flesh and nail? Explain. Well, your right hand, when it hits the string, it has to hit with the flesh first, and that deadens the previous note, and the nail plays the next note. He says, I begin practicing every day with flesh and nail. Guitar 101. So, how do you get to Holiness 101? Well, you begin at home. You begin by loving God with all your heart, your mind, your soul. You begin with the commandment of Jesus, which is in all its utter simplicity, is so beautiful yet so complex. Yet you begin with the small things. You begin with the most elemental things, like prayer. I've been talking to you about prayer for many years now. Just 10 minutes a day. That's all I've asked. That's all I've asked of you. Surely you can do more than that, but at least 10 minutes a day. There are varieties of prayers you can use, but at least starting with that. It is fulfilling in some ways the great commandment of Jesus, loving God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul. It's beginning with those very simple, elemental things. And then it's moving from there. It's connecting the dots from prayer to corporate worship. Here, coming here, to be reminded that we are always in the process of being deconstructed and reconstructed in the image of God. That's what life is about. It's attending to the details of what that means. And then it's attending to the details of the world beyond us and connecting all of the dots between all of those little things. There's a great theologian that once wrote a book that says it all. And the name of the book is God in the Details. God in the details. It's connecting the dots, the details of your life. Home life, corporate worship, life in the world, and always making sure the foundation is set for the poor and the outcast. These are first things. This is what it's about. This is the foundation that is laid for us in Jesus as He gave us the great commandment that we repeat time and again here because it is the essence of Torah, or the way of God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and yourself, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is Holiness 101. Amen.